So we recently got another developer live stream for Dune Awakening where we got a ton of new information, some of the most exciting parts of this being an explanation on how the game is going to be an MMO and how the server structure and different maps are actually gonna work. And since Dune Awakening has been released, we have definitely gotten just tons of people saying that this is just going to be Conan Exiles, it's not gonna actually be an MMO, but this should very much put to bed any of those comments because anybody that sees this information can't continue saying that this is not going to be an MMO. And we have gotten some interviews previous to this that did lay out quite a bit of this information, but it did leave some stuff out. So we didn't know a lot of the specifics that we got in this developer live stream. And I've done multiple videos going over that. And it seems I was right in most of the cases. So after watching this developer live stream and reading an official post that was made after this that went into some more detail, we have pretty much all the information we need, and a graphic the developers released shows pretty much all of the information you need to know about how Dune Awakening servers are actually going to work. So one of the first decisions you're going to have to make when starting up Dune Awakening is choosing a world. And as you can see on this graphic, they have World 1, World 2, World 3, World 4. Now they're probably going to be named, but worlds are going to work in pretty much the same way other MMO servers or realms would work. So let's say you're playing World of Warcraft back in 2004, you would go choose one realm and you would only be able to see other players that also chose that realm. You wouldn't be able to see or play with players on other realms. That's exactly how worlds in Dune Awakening are going to work. So let's say you choose World 1. You will never see other players from any of the other worlds when you're playing on World 1. And you're not going to be able to like transfer characters off and go to other worlds. If you want to play in another world, you have to go select that world and then make a new character to do that. So now you've chosen your world, you've created a character, and the first place you're going to be going and where you're going to be starting the game is Hagga Basin. And Hagga Basin is going to have a minimum of 40 players, and going off of other information we've gotten, it's seeming like they're trying to get to 100 or 120 player caps for every instance or server of Hagga Basin. Now remember, as we go through all of this, nobody else from other worlds can be on here. So if I mentioned something else as a different server or a different instance, that's all still located on your overarching world. And we're going to be on World 1 for this explanation. Now, Hagga Basin is going to be split up into a bunch of different servers because there's going to be, let's say, up to 120 players on an instance or server of Hagga Basin. And Hagga Basin is going to be the size of the Conan Exiles map. So it's going to be quite large. And this is just going to be your kind of starter area. And this is also going to play the role of your persistent home. When you go and choose a Hagga Basin to play on, this is where you're going to be building your permanent base. This is where you're always going to be going back to. And we did also get an explanation of these different areas. So Hagga Basin is described as this is where you start out and where you will always return. It's a big, persistent open world similar in size to the map in Conan Exiles, and it consists of many different biomes. Here you must survive, build, and fight in the same space as several dozen other players. So as mentioned, like up to 100 or 120 players, who all also belong to the server you picked. Players from other servers cannot come here. Player versus player combat exists only in select areas of Hagga Basin. Now, what's interesting in this description is that they mention players from other servers cannot come here. Now, this is either them mixing up how they're describing things, because they did kind of compare the overarching world you choose to servers from other MMOs, but it sounds like what they're meaning by this is that once you go to Hagga Basin, as mentioned and as shown in the graphic, there's a bunch of different instances or servers of Hagga Basin. It sounds like you're also going to be choosing one of those, and that's going to be your permanent Hagga Basin, and there's going to be a bunch of these Hagga Basins for your specific world. Now, there is a smaller possibility that they're just talking about your overarching world and the different instances or servers of Hagga Basin you'll be able to travel between, but I'm putting my money that you choose a Hagga Basin when you start the game, and you can't really transfer to other Hagga Basins. Now, Now, I also think there's a good possibility that there's going to be some way that you can transfer to other Hagga Basins on your world. So maybe if you want to transfer to a different Hagga Basin server, you'd have to like destroy every building and every trace of you from the Hagga Basin you're currently playing on, because it was also mentioned that you can join guilds from those different servers in your world. So it wouldn't make a ton of sense you could join guilds with those, but you wouldn't actually be able to transfer between those in any way. Or there's also just a possibility that you have to create a new character to play on those different servers of Hagga Basin. So this is one of the parts that we're not 100% sure on, but either way, Hagga Basin is going to be the size of Conan Exiles. It's going to be, let's say, up to 100 and 120 players. It's going to be primarily PvE focused with specific PvP zones, and this is going to be your persistent home where you build a permanent base and you can do a lot more PvE progression here. So you've been playing and progressing on Hagga Basin, maybe you've joined a guild and you're all building your bases there, and once you get to a certain point, you're able to progress enough to craft yourself an ornithopter. And ornithopters is how you're going to travel between all of the different maps of Dune Awakening, because Hagga Basin is just the start. Now, once you get that ornithopter, you'll have a few different areas you can go travel to. You could travel to any of the social hubs, which at the start is going to be Arakeen and Harko Village. There's going to be social hubs or big cities controlled by different factions, so they're going to be completely different cities in different areas of kind of the overall world of Arrakis. And these are going to be social hubs, so you're not going to be PvPing here or in combat or driving vehicles here. These are just going to be places you pick up quests, you interact with other players, because they're going to be social hubs with potentially up to like 200 players in them. There's going to be vendors, there's going to be quest pickups, there's going to be different factions you have reputations with. There's going to be the Grand Exchange, which is the auction house for your overarching world. Then there's even going to be things like nightclubs. Now, what's a bit different with these social hubs is that when you're in a social hub, they're going to have some player cap, but they're not going to have different servers like, say, Hagga Basin does. So if the current instance of a social hub you're in gets filled up, the game will just spin up another instance of that social hub, and additional players going to that social hub will just be put in that new instance. So you can think of this as kind of a bigger version of like the tower from Destiny 2. But let's say you don't want to go to a social hub, instead you want some PvP action, and that would take you to the Deep Desert. Now, the Deep Desert is also going to work a bit differently than the other zones, because unlike Hagga Basin that has all these different servers that are split up, Deep Desert is going to be one massive shared area. So anybody on your overarching world will be in the same shared areas. You'll all be able to see each other. There's not going to be different servers splitting up the people on your world. And the Deep Desert is going to be multiple times larger than the Conan Exiles map. So remember, Hagga Basin, around the size of the Conan Exiles map, Deep Desert, multiple times bigger. And how this is going to work is the Deep Desert is going to be a bunch of different meshed servers stitched together. So let's say one section is one mesh server that, let's say, has a cap of 500 players, which is actually the caps they want in the Deep Desert. But let's say another section is another stitched together server with another cap of 500 players. Now, those are both still shared areas. So anybody from your world in that area or in that section of the Deep Desert, you can see. It's not instance, there's not a bunch of different versions of it. And these different servers that are stitched together are going to be seamless to travel between. The main reason that it's going to be these different servers stitched together is so they can have this massive landmass with a lot of players, but it's hosted on different servers. So one section could say have a battle of 300 people, and the other section wouldn't be negatively impacted by 300 people fighting each other and probably having some server lag. Now, we don't know exactly how many different servers are going to be stitched together. Going off of the graphic, it looks like it's going to be 3 different sections, but there's definitely the possibility that there's more than 3 sections of the Deep Desert. Now, there's a few additional pretty big distinctions comparing the Deep Desert to the other areas of Dune Awakening. First off, it's all PvP. If you see other people that's not like your friends or your guildmates, you can go fight them instantly. The entirety of the Deep Desert is just open PvP, open combat. So it's going to be a lot more risky to be here. That also means it's going to be a lot more lucrative, because this is also where you're going to primarily obtain spice. Spice obviously being one one of the most valuable resources in the Dune universe. It's going to be similar in Dune Awakening. It's not only going to be a currency you use for different things, but it's also going to be a way that you empower your abilities and skills in the game. Now, we don't have a lot of specifics on that, but there's going to be spice blows everywhere to where you can try to harvest and obtain all these resources. Then there's just going to be tons of other objectives like dungeons and crashed aircraft that you could go scavenge for resources. So there's going to be different things everywhere with tons of rare resources. And we did also get the confirmation that you will be able to build in the deep desert. But there's one pretty big mechanic in the deep desert that's going to have a pretty big impact on all of that, and that's the Coriolis storms. So on a weekly basis, a massive Coriolis storm is going to sweep through the entirety of the deep desert. And what this is going to do is it's going to destroy most, if not all, player buildings. There may be a way to protect your buildings so they're not fully destroyed, but it's also going to change up all of the content you're going to come across in the deep desert. So one week you may come across all these points of interest and things to go explore, and the next week after the Coriolis storm, all of those points of interest can be changed. So maybe you found this one cave one week, and then the Coriolis storm comes through. Next week, that cave would be completely covered, and maybe there's a new point of interest nearby. There's also going to be some amounts of procedural generation within this, but we don't know if that's going to be procedural generation after the game is developed or if that's going to be procedural generation within development. And by that, I mean, we don't know if they're procedurally generating things and then kind of tuning it and changing it up for when it's released, or if they're creating this procedural system where every week it procedurally generates a bunch of new pieces of content. So we don't know exactly how that's going to work, but it more sounds like they're going to make all of these handcrafted points of interest, and then as the storm comes through, it's kind of going to procedurally generate locations, which ones are actually available that week, and maybe even have some more randomized elements like what type of enemies are at that point of interest. And the Coriolis storm is actually going to have a pretty big impact on a lot of different elements of the game. Because, for example, we know there's going to be schematics. So you may find a really rare schematic of a rare weapon, and you may be the only person that currently has that schematic. Because what could happen is there could be a rare schematic from one of the points of interest in the deep desert. You could go there, you could get lucky and get it, and then the Coriolis storm could come through and cover up that point of interest, meaning it's no longer available until maybe next week or even like a week after, or a few weeks on the road. So you could be the only person on your world with access to that weapon schematic. You could be the only one for a handful of weeks that could make this rare sought after weapon, and you could just spam make them for the next couple weeks and put them all up on the market, and then a lot of other players would want to buy those, and you could just make yourself rich off being the only one to have that schematic for this period of time. There's going to be a bunch of different things that this plays into. There's going to be quite a lot of sandbox elements built into the Coriolis storm. Now, another piece of Dune Awakening that I kind of glossed over is the Overland map. And this is also shown in this graphic with the ornithopters traveling around, because in game there's actually going to be this map that you travel in your ornithopter map to map. So if you're in Hagga Basin, you take your ornithopter and it takes you to this different map, this kind of top-down map, where you then would take your ornithopter and travel to, say, one of the social hubs. But there's actually going to be more gameplay within that. Because if your ornithopter, say, runs out of fuel going to a different area, you will actually be put in what seems to be a procedurally generated piece of the map where you have to land and go scavenge for fuel or water or other resources to then finish your trip to one of the other maps. And I have heard some people say that this will probably get annoying to where you just want to travel to where you're going, but I think this is actually something that's pretty interesting depending on how interesting this like procedurally generated area is going to be. Because if you're not being safe, you're not having enough fuel to actually get to the next area, this could actually add a good amount of content and actually allow you to get to some place you may not have been able to before. So I do think this could actually be a pretty interesting element. And I do also like how they're going about this Overland map, because as I mentioned, when you're flying your ornithopter, it's kind of this top-down view. You're not actually in like first or third person anymore, but I do think this is an an interesting way to have map-to-map travel. You also will see any other player traveling in the Overland map in their ornithopters as well. It's definitely a much more interactive and interesting way to have map-to-map travel because a lot of other games don't have this. So I do think this is a more interactive and interesting way to have map-to-map travel. And the last piece of this is actually some teases at future content and future maps, because they went on to explain that one of the reasons they chose this way to go about crafting Dune Awakening is because they think it's easier to add in new maps to this Overland map that you travel between instead of having one overarching world where they would have to add more sections of an open world. And this is actually something that's much more common in MMOs than you would think. Even going to something like World of Warcraft, a lot of people kind of think of World of Warcraft as a big open world game, but they actually do the same thing with expansions. So if you played World of Warcraft in vanilla, you had Kalimdor, you had the Eastern Kingdom, these two massive open world maps, but you go into TBC and you have to go through the Dark Portal, go through a load screen to get to TBC and to get to Draenor. It's basically just a different map like you would be traveling to in Dune Awakening. Wrath of the Lich King releases and you have to take a boat from Kalimdor or the Eastern Kingdoms to go to Northrend. You get on a boat and then it's a load screen and then you show up in Northrend. So that's a very similar thing to traveling map to map in Dune Awakening. And as shown on this graphic, there's 3 question mark areas, which is going to be future content to where they add in new maps. Now we don't know how those new maps are going to function. Are they going to be similar to Hagga Basin or are they going to be similar to the Deep Desert? Presumably there's also going to be social hubs added in later down the road. This is just a kind of way to future-proof additional content, because one thing they have mentioned multiple times is Dune Awakening is going to be a full live service MMO. They're going to add new areas, they're going to add new maps, they're going to explore the rest of Arrakis, and they even mentioned after they've explored the entirety of Arrakis, including the polar ice caps, which is pretty interesting, they then would be adding in more planets to visit, because there are also a lot of additional planets in the Dune universe. So this is definitely going to be a game that gets a lot of future content. But that's pretty much all the information I want to go over on how Dune is going to be an MMO, how the server structure is going to be working, and how traveling between all of the different maps is actually going to work. And this definitely makes me more excited for the game. This is also something that I think is going to massively increase the excitement for this game, because a lot of people, again, just thought that this was going to be like Conan Exiles and that they were calling it an MMO just for marketing purposes. But after this information, I think a lot of people are rightly going to see, no, this is actually a pretty massive MMO. That's definitely really exciting. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.